So, today we're finishing off chapter 1 of the book of Acts. It's kind of nice how this chapter's kind of neatly flowed into three pretty partitioned sections for us. The overall volume of verses here is larger than the previous 2 weeks, almost combined. But fortunately it's a fairly straightforward, free-flowing passage. That has good implication for kind of what this opening chapter is trying to establish, the foundation of the church. It's obviously covering this brief interluding period between the Ascension and Pentecost, which is 10 days. And so there's a number of good points that we'll be able to draw out here as we go through and exegete the text and see what it has to say. Before we begin, let me just open in prayer. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. So, the specific section that we're going to be looking at today will be from verse 12 right through to the end of the chapter in verse 26. What we have here, just to set kind of the parameters or to set the framework of exactly what it is that we're looking at topically, a number of your Bible, if your Bible has headings, it might say something to the effect of Matthias chosen to replace Judas, or any kind of derivation thereof. The actual portion here involves more than that. It's giving us, again, the context in which this is occurring. There's a number of historical components which we'll address that kind of help us inform our understanding of what this is saying to us. But the primary build-up of this portion as it leads to the end of the chapter is in the replacement of Judas Iscariot as a disciple, or in this case now apostle. He's also included in here, and we'll explain some intricacies involving the one sentence dedicated to him. And so there's a number of really good things that will be here for us. There's some cross-references both to points further on in Acts, which we'll touch on in brevity as relevant, and then as well as some specific areas from multiple Psalms, which this text actually quotes from. So let's begin in verse 12, and we'll begin our exegesis from there. So, verse 12. What I'll do is I'll read for us the entire passage first, and then we'll jump back to that specific verse. So I'll pick up in verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, or the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room, where they were staying, Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. All these were with one accord, were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary the mother of Jesus, and his brothers, or you could also say brothers and sisters there. Verse 15, in those days Peter stood up among the brothers, the company of persons was in all about 120, and said, Brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke beforehand by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus. For he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their own language Acheldama, that is, the field of blood. For it is written, that's a parenthesis from Luke there. Now Peter picks up again. For it is written in the book of Psalms, May his camp become desolate, and let there be no one to dwell in it. And let another take his office. So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John, as in John the Baptist, until the day when he was taken up from us. One of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. And they put forward two, Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. So in other words, you have Joseph, aka Barsabbas, aka Justus, semicolon, and the second guy, Matthias. Just wanted to make sure that was okay grammatically for everyone. And they prayed and said, "You, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place." And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles, now 12. So that's the text there from verse 12 through to the end of chapter 1 in verse 26. So let's begin specifically exegeting from verse 12. So then they, again, following on from what we looked at last week, that the Mount of Olives, the ascension occurs, etc., etc. After this, they then return to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. That there is pointing, it's a kind of gliding reference there. It's just Luke doing decent history and decent recounting. A Sabbath day's journey, to cut a long story short, is it's a little over a kilometre. It's referencing back to the limitations on travel and i.e. work on Sabbath day in the Torah, in the law. And so it is roughly speaking it's actually a bit closer to about 1.1 kilometres. But anyway, a little over a kilometre away, which is where the Mount of Olives is. So it's just simply he's giving the layout of where they were, coming from the Mount of Olives back to Jerusalem, as in the city proper. So, verse 13. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying. And then now we get the list of exactly who that was in specificity, right? Peter and John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, and a number of these names are obviously familiar from the gospel accounts themselves. Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, as well as Judas the son of James, not to be confused obviously with Judas Iscariot. Judas was a fairly common name in Hebrew. All these, with one accord, were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers, or his brothers and sisters. So, a number of things in that kind of little setting we're getting here. First off, them entering into the upper room. It's useful to explain what that is, because again, we're trying to be able to engage with this text historically. We're trying to understand historical narrative here, right? So important to understand the actual context that we're being given. I'll get onto that in a second. There's some papers sitting there in the middle that you might be wondering what they are. We'll get onto that in a second, because this is where those come into play. So an upper room, or what we're being given there as the upper room, it's obviously the phrase that's used by both Luke and Mark in their Gospels as to where the Last Supper occurred. It's using that same phrase of what we would call in English the upper room. Interestingly, Mark and Luke, again, keep in mind Luke also writes Acts, use a different word for that, probably simply in the reality that's just a synonym. Why I explain that will become irrelevant in just a second. But nevertheless, this upper room was... How do we, in the 21st century, kind of visualize what this looked like from their perspective, given our distance culturally and historically from that? It wasn't uncommon by any stretch of the imagination, especially in sizable cities like Jerusalem, to have multi-storied houses all over the place. Obviously, economics has always been economics. There was obviously always been differences in socioeconomic status between peoples in quite literally any culture you would ever want to point to. But nevertheless, specifically in this particular case with Jerusalem, there are a number of details here that I'll cross-reference in a second with other parts that are indicating to us that this upper room is clearly in the home of someone who is wealthy. Okay, that'll become apparent. I'll explain that in a minute. The concept of an upper room, to give you an oversimplified explanation of of ancient Judean architecture. Lower stories of houses were for work and or housekeeping elements of that nature. It was for services. It was for you would be able to then have home businesses out of there, which is what a lot of places were. It was mightily uncommon to have a business that was not based in the home. Kind of to have your home in then some separate business location was really, really rare. No matter what kind of business you wanted to talk about, blacksmiths, carpentry, all those kinds of things, be they laborious or even more what today we would just call white collar, people like lawyers and physicians and other such things would be operating, generally speaking, out of their homes, and it would be in those lower areas. Places for food storage, animals as well. We, in our context, kind of think of animals being out in barns or in outhouses in those kinds of settings. Not necessarily the case in ancient Near Eastern culture at all, because you ran too great a risk of them being stolen, far too great a risk of a variety of things going wrong. So animals of all kinds, including like just run-of-the-mill livestock, sheep, cattle, various other things, many times were often kept in those downstairs areas of the home. It was partitioned and it was sizable, and it's also the kind of environment in which, we get an interesting thing when we talk about Jesus being born in that kind of setting as well. A lot of historical details of this kind of image of him being born out in like in a farm setting like that isn't exactly historically accurate. We won't go down that rabbit hole because that would take forever. But nevertheless, what you then had is that downstairs. Houses then had second stories quite often. That is where you would essentially class it as living quarters, not exclusively, but it would be living quarters. You would have what we could probably call bedrooms, although they're very much not like our homes today. Bedrooms today, in terms of housing designs, are a lot like hotels, where you have individual rooms. That didn't exist, not en masse. All of the family, and family often far include, family was not just simply a base nuclear family of mum, dad plus kids. It was grandparents, it was cousins, it was uncles, it was aunts, it was much more extent. That was the definition of family a lot of the time across cultures in ancient society. And you would all just be sleeping boom, 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 right next to each other. So it was also where, in wealthier contexts, where entertainment would occur, right? So in houses that were wealthier, that were built up to a far greater degree, that were more lavish in nature, and this was especially the case in major city centres, be it Jerusalem or especially places like Athens or Rome or those kinds of cities. It would often be the place where entertaining could also be done. Often you can entertain both downstairs and upstairs, actually, in houses like that. But entertaining and dining could often be done upstairs as well. Thinking of it almost as having essentially a dining hall upstairs, especially if your home was 3 stories. Now, what I mean by 3 stories is those kind of 2-story layout and then an upper room on top, which would actually be surrounded. It would actually kind of technically, if you're trying to picture this in your mind's eye, think of it almost like actually being on the roof. Does that make more sense? Yeah. Roofs, plenty of roofs had, obviously the Greeks and others had triangular roofs at certain points throughout their history, kind of like a lot of homes do here, like you see across there, in the building across there, that kind of roofing. But in the Middle East, that wasn't the case. Housing like that and roofing like that was non-existent. It was flat, squared roofs, yep. And almost universally, other than select buildings, it would be a rooftop terrace, okay? And you can go to the Middle East today and you'll find that all over the place, right? People have homes like that. That's standard house architecture in many places, right? Jordan, Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, you can go places in Israel, right? There's plenty of places today where that still is housing designing. Half the problems that our troops had in Iraq when you're trying to clear Ramadi is spotters or RPGs or snipers on rooftops. Right? That was half the problem. Because in a Middle Eastern context where it is hot, but B, also the nighttime, whilst it can actually get rather cold, it provides a nice, cool environment where people would often sleep on the roof. where people would stay up late at night on the roof. And so the roof was very much a part of the, house usage, if that makes any sense. And so wealthy households up on this roof section would also have an enclosed kind of quasi third story, aka an upper room. Okay, so we get this kind of idea that this was clearly wealthy when we compile a number of references from, it would take us a while to go through them, so I'll run you through them. When we get references from later on in Acts 12, in reference to this house, where there's an upper room of Mary, the mother of, I believe of memory, Mark. Yes. So Mark as in John Mark, as in Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark. His mother Mary, not Mary, Mary was the most common name for women in that time. Mary's is the equivalent of a John Smith today. So Mary, the mother of Mark, was clearly quite wealthy, because when we get cross-references from places like Acts 12, we also get another cross-reference in Paul's letter when he's rounding off his letter to the Colossians in chapter 4, somewhere around verse 10 off memory, referring to this usage of this upper home, this Mary, in this case reference to the mother of Mark, and as well as the aunt of Barsabbas. But what we get from that description across those multiple accountings of this place is that a wealthy home with an upper room, almost certainly in this case like a quasi third story. It was lavish, right? So in other words, it was well decorated. It also had a fence, meaning that it had an exterior wall, right? So you had the home, you would have had courtyards, gardens, etc., and then an exterior wall around it as well, hence the gate, and it also had servants. All right? This is communicating to us. In this case, Rhoda is the young servant that's mentioned in Acts 12, when Peter has escaped from prison. The story to recount is where he essentially makes the guards to either go blind or go to sleep or something of that nature. But long story short, something happens. The angel of God opens the gates. Peter escapes and comes here to the church in Jerusalem, right? And knocks on and comes to the gate, right? And this servant Rhoda answers, and it's a whole funny encounter. Because Rhoda's runs back inside saying there's an angel at the door and blah, 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 and they don't believe her. And anyway. And then Peter becomes a wanted fugitive on the run. Anyway, this is clearly indicating this is a wealthy home. Right? You don't have upper rooms, you don't have decorated floors and walls, you don't have exterior courtyards with gates and walls, let alone servants. In a place that's not a wealthy home, yeah. So clearly, Mary, the mother of Mark, was a wealthy woman, wealthy household, right, wealthy family, and it was being used in this particular manner. Now, there is, to be open and fair, there is some historical question as to whether or not this upper room that's being identified here is the same kind of upper room that is being referred to by Luke and Mark in their Gospels concerning where the Last Supper occurred. The debate there comes down to linguistics. A different word is used. So like here, huperoon is used to reference this concept of an upper room. Hupo, it's the same prefix which we get hyper in English, right? Hypersonic, it's above, beyond. So upper room, right? And so a different word is used, but it's pretty likely that it's just simply a synonym. How was your day? Wasn't good. How was your day? It was bad. Okay, you're saying the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just synonyms. So it is entirely possible that this room that we're having here is the room that the Last Supper occurred in, especially given the relative time frame, right? Because this is not all that long in terms of the grand scope of things. We're now between 40 and 50 days after the resurrection, right? It's not that long, right? In time frame. Plus, it's in Jerusalem, so this is where they were hiding out from the Jews. And this sense of familiarity clearly meant that they felt some connection to this place. So those kind of contextual factors as well inform us that it more likely than not that it's the biggest issue in the world, but more likely not was also potentially the place where the Last Supper occurred. Yep.
It's not really that important, but Jesus told them to go find a man with a pitcher.
Yeah.
And we'll lead you to the fully furnished room. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound like this, but hey, I wasn't there.
No, exactly. It's but it also speaks. But the thing with that reference too is that could have been a servant of this household. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of, it's fitting that same. You know what I mean? There's consistency in the detailing. Yeah, it's almost like when we looked at Theophilus at the beginning in week 1. We're piecing together historical data. That's all. And if there's a consistent element, it's heading in the trajectory of this could be blah, 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 right? That's all. If you want to have a pass around, there's 6 of those there. What this is what the image is. There's 2 pages in each, and just pass one back there as well. What this is a real place. This is a place in Jerusalem called the Kenikel. Got the one more there? Yeah, there you go. So this is in Jerusalem today. You'll be able to see it. Yeah. Or it's a potential candidate. So this is a place called the Kenikel, coming from the Latin cenocularum, meaning the dining room, right? Cena or ceno in Latin means to dine. Okay, so an upper room. You find this in, and I'll make this as simple as possible, old city of Jerusalem, right, the historic city of Jerusalem, around which modern Jerusalem's kind of been built around. You can think of, not exactly, but just for simplicity's sake, you can think of it as a square, which is divided into 4 quadrants, okay? The bottom right corner, kind of today called the Jewish corner, part of that was historically known as the Herodian quarter, right? As in the Herods, as in the Herodian dynasty that ruled Judea in the 1st century. That southern portion split between, so you have in the bottom right corner the Jewish quarter, the bottom left corner the Armenian quarter. Again, those details aren't exactly relevant, but in that kind of southern half, very broadly speaking, not all of it, but parts of it, was clearly historically where the wealthy suburbs around Jerusalem in those days, near to the palace of Caiaphas, of Annas, the high priests, the dynasty of high priests there, relatively close to the temple as well. It was clear there have been a number of excavations done, and a number of places that have actually just been maintained historically for the last, at the bare minimum, 1,700 years. Realistically, it's more than that. Places like this. And so this is one of the candidates for, and most likely out of other candidates for, the actual upper room. The advantage of places like Jerusalem is that so many people have had a vested interest in it, from the Jews to Christians and obviously later on to Muslims, that a lot of things have been preserved. It's the one advantage of wanting a place, is that you generally don't tend to raze it and burn it to the ground, not when you're wanting to actually use it. And so there's these places. Also another place called the Burnt House. It's actually known as that due to some burning. It's also historically very well preserved. But long story short, to look at those pictures, more important part for getting the actual locational component is just actually to give you an idea of what an upper room at a wealthy home in ancient Judea and the ancient Roman world generally would have looked approximately like. You're going to be seeing a number of details that have been added in later. So the vaulted roof, the patterns of the vaulted roof, that's a later on addition. There's a number of that was actually specifically converted into a mosque when the Ottomans conquered Jerusalem. So in the 1500s, it was converted into a mosque. So there are a number of Islamic elements in there as well. Obviously, the Corinthian columns, those columns in the middle there are likely later additions, although potentially not. There's some interesting detail, but that kind of room is really quite spacious. That room in reality is quite honestly pretty much the same size as that hall. Right about, it's nearly the same size as that hall. In terms of just sheer dimension, in terms of length and width, pretty close to the size of that. Okay, so this is the kind, you can imagine how sizable the home needs to generally be to have that. Okay, this is not like some little closet just kind of perched up the top. right? This is for guests, this is for dining, this is for hosting, right? These kinds of things, right? And that informs what we then come to read afterwards. Okay, so if you turn back to Acts, having just given you an image of the kind of setting that it could have looked like, let's go to verse 14, and then some of the details pertaining to the upper room will come relevant when you get on to 15. Verse 13 we've had described the apostles who was there. Verse 14 we're then told that all these, with one accord, were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his, as in Jesus, brothers and or sisters. So, what we are essentially being, it's a very pithy way of saying it, and you might not actually read it if you kind of just gloss over it. This is, for all intents and purposes, the first proverbial church service. Right, you know what I mean? Being together with one accord, of one mind, right? The same worship, blah, blah, and devoting themselves to prayer. That's kind of a shorthand phrase that's used more than once to this kind of fellowshipping that's going on in a New Testament context. Here they're devoting themselves to worship, right? They're gathering as an ecclesia, small they be, but nevertheless, and worshipping God in this upper room. And so that's what informs us, by the way, because, again, I know some of you are familiar with this, but the first century context for the church was not great massive cathedrals. We didn't start off that way. We got there eventually. But we started off in house churches or home churches in this kind of context, right? It's kind of what we referenced when we looked at Theophilus, right? Everyone has their different roles to play. Often the role that wealthy statesmen or women from wealthy families or whatever the context was, often the role they could play was resources, right? And providing facility, providing those kinds of resources that were then used in that fashion. This upper room is the foundation of the Church of Jerusalem. Okay, this is where it's happening, and so yeah. So they're meeting together, as it says, along with the other women who had been accompanying them, who'd been with them kind of for most of the journey with Jesus as well. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is specifically referenced there. If I'm not mistaken, this is actually the last specific reference we get to Mary, the mother of Jesus. We know from other secondary historical sources that, for those who recall, Jesus asked John, as in John the Evangelist, not John the Baptist, but John, Gospel of John, to take care of his mother. From what we understand historically, he fulfilled that promise, right? He did take care of her. Obviously, he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos for a period, which is where he wrote the Revelation. But we know historically that he came back from Patmos, right? That exile ended, and he came back to Ephesus, where he had been exiled from, and was taking care of Mary in Ephesus. What beyond that? Pretty much impossible to tell. But the historical evidence is reasonably strong in giving us that historical accounting of he and Mary moving to Ephesus, him taking care of her, and the church at Ephesus, I think people like Timothy and so on, taking care of Mary there. And so this is actually the last specific reference we get to her, but she was taken care of. John did fulfill the promise he made to Jesus to take care of her. And so, I thought I'd just mention that as well.
Where's Joseph on here? Joseph's not here.
No. Yeah. Early. Yeah. Joseph died in the what we call the gospel interlude. So in other words, between the gospels essentially give us 3 time frames. It gives us the nativity, or the first 2 years, right, from birth through to the refuge in Egypt and back. We then jump forward to that 12, 13 age mark, and then we jump forward to 30 when he begins ministry. He passed away in that 12 to 30 period, somewhere in there, and we know that because we don't get any reference to him. It would make no sense. It would make no sense to just reference Mary without also referencing Joseph, by every account, yeah.
The brothers and sisters are very interesting for many reasons.
Yeah.
Especially for those who might be from Roman Catholic background.
Yeah, I know you're going with this, yeah.
Think about it. Jesus had a lot of siblings. Those siblings would have had a lot of children.
Yep.
It's very likely that today in Jerusalem or somewhere on earth, There are
I've made,
descendants.
yeah, I've made this point before. You know, yeah, I've made this point before that yeah, it's entirely likely that with the amount of people, it's statistically very unlikely that, especially with the conversion of James, right? Eventually, but the conversion of James, our brother, it's overwhelmingly likely, yeah, that the descendants thereof are still alive today. Of Jesus' what would technically be half brothers and half sisters. So the actual biological children of Joseph and Mary, right? Who Joseph and Mary had after Mary had Jesus, if that makes sense. Yep. Yeah, especially because we know historically from Josephus and others that the church at Jerusalem listened to the warnings that were given about the fall of Jerusalem, and they fled Jerusalem. We know historically that they fled, right, to the east, to the mountains, and they got out of Jerusalem before Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans. So we know that historically. So connecting the logic, which is exactly the point there, that Jesus' own family, right, under Joseph and Mary, part of the church of Jerusalem, they fled, therefore they survived. It's entirely possible that, what's the probability that every one of them, by the time you've had kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and the multiplication that occurs in that fashion, especially with how large families were, and historically have been, it's highly unlikely that the entire bloodline got wiped out, either in the fall of Jerusalem or in the conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate, or the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Ottoman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Mongols, whatever. It's highly unlikely that all the different conquests that occurred of the Middle East over that next 2,000-year period, it's highly unlikely that they ever got completely wiped out. So you would actually have descendants of Mary and Joseph alive today, in all statistical likelihood. Yeah, I've made that point before. It's a fascinating thing. Yeah, I wasn't going to exactly. I wasn't going to bring it up as a major point of this text, but I'm actually glad you did. It's fascinating. Yeah. So good point. Thank you. Okay, so one other little brief reference, and then moving on. Because it can sometimes become relevant when you're reading other parts of either Acts or even Revelation to an extent. Back in verse 13, one of the references is Simon the Zealot. You'll see it in the latter after James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot and Judas the son of James. The Zealots were one of the what you might call factions of Jerusalem in those days. They were a revolutionary political group, terrorists to some, freedom fighters to the others, to kind of use those terms anachronistically. Their political ideology was very fervent, hence their name, the Zealots. And their political ideology, in 25 words or less, was kind of along the lines of what has been discussed before, actually discussed last week, right? Their ideology was the kind of hyper-elevated version of the general kind of cultural conscience of the day, which is Messiah will come back, conquer the Romans, establish the physical kingdom here on earth right now. They were kind of the ideological driver of that, and they were the most fervently and religiously devout to that ideology. Okay, so they had an entire paramilitary, assassins, the whole box and dice. They were a active political group that also engaged in paramilitary and guerrilla warfare. When I referenced that famine on Sunday, and I gave you that brief anecdote from Josephus, so the reason why that famine occurred, that famine in Jerusalem occurred, was not just, they got starved out by the Romans and siege. No, the Zealots actually caused it purposefully. So to give you an idea, we know from accounts that Jerusalem had potentially as much as 3 years worth of food in store. So they could have outlasted that Roman siege for years, right? Which is a massive time. Sieges normally historically go for months, rarely ever for years, but they could have lasted that. They had enough food for 3 years. That was until the Zealots went and burnt all the food to force their fellow Jews to take the fight to the Romans. So They went from having 3 years worth of food to having less than about 5 months worth of food. And when that food runs out, famine. So the zealots actually caused the famine purposefully. That's how dedicated, that's how religiously dedicated they were. That's how zealous they were. They burnt the city's food to force their fellow Jews to take the fight to the Romans because that's what they wanted. That's how that famine started. So Simon was part of that group. In what capacity, we're not told in any specificity. But to be part of that, you weren't a peripheral member of the Zealots. You're a very active member, perhaps to the point of espionage, paramilitary organisation, assassinations, blah, blah. So he obviously had converted out of that and became a follower of Christ. Only because historically when you're reading about the Zealots, it sometimes comes up throughout the scriptures because we just only get references to such and such the Zealot, or the Zealots pop up every now and then throughout the Gospel, and things like that. So, verse 15, let's continue on. So, in those days, obviously speaking at the time between Ascension and Pentecost, Peter stood up among the brothers, parentheses, the company of persons was in all about 120, right? And you can see how 120 people could fit in that upper room. Do you know what I mean? And again, so I'm talking about facilities and resources. So there's about 120 of them, of people who have, again, well, obviously we're always given the mark here about the disciples, the now 11 of them, but there were also still these peripheries. Right? You also have to remember that Jesus appeared to 500 people, so X percentage of them could have followed Christ after that, you know what I mean, things like that. And so Peter said to them, brothers, the scripture, now he's specifically talking to these men here, brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke beforehand by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus. We'll get on. He quotes that in a minute, so we'll touch on that in a second. Verse 17, for he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Luke kind of now cuts here and puts his own parenthesis in, so this is Luke now writing from verse 18. Now this man, referring to Judas, acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling head first. Interesting, that word's a bit of a double entendre. You could actually almost say swelling up. It's usually used in reference to swelling up with pride, but here he's using it kind of as a double entendre of swelling up, as in literally swelling up, and that becomes the case here. So having fallen headlong, he burst open in the middle, as in the middle of his body, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their own language Acheldama, that is the field of blood. Right, so that's Luke's interjection. So he's giving us detailing what happened to Judas. Now, what happens is that we're told elsewhere in the New Testament that he was hanged, as in like he hung himself, right? He committed suicide. But here Luke's saying that he fell and hit the ground and pancaked himself. And so here what's kind of going on, right? Because sometimes it's been one of those lazy points that atheists on the internet often make about contradictions in the Bible without actually bothering to read the text. The answer is both. He hung himself, right, out of the guilt. The field, in terms of him purchasing that field, you recall that the money actually got given back. So that field was actually purchased by the religious upper class. But anyway, that part's immaterial. He committed suicide after having done so. Hung himself, right? Eventually, over time, that body, if it's not taken down, is A, two things are going to happen. That rope's going to start to fray and decay, and B, natural decomposition is going to take place. So, obviously, the setting of fluids in this case, if he's hung himself, fluids are going to settle in the lower extremities. Yep, exactly. Right, just going to shift the center of mass, center of gravity. Gas is going to naturally build up, especially if it's out in the sun day after day after day after day, right? Not being eaten by animals because assuming it's still hanging in a tree or hanging from wherever it's hanging from. So there's not that other kind of secondary decomposition going on by scavengers. And so eventually that rope would fray, right, under the weight of especially the shift of gravity that's occurring, right, the gas that's building up. And then when that body falls, it's going to hit the ground and the gas is going to make it explode. That's what happens. So there's no logical contradiction. There's no contradiction in the text. He hung himself, and then this happened later on. This is what he's describing. Okay? Minor point, but it's one of those, it's a very lazy point that people try to bring up about where the Bible supposedly contradicts itself. And so...
How would he fall headlong? I mean, surely if the rope frayed, he would just...
Yeah, this is just a phrase of the way we're putting it in English. It's falling in terms. It's just describing the manner in which a body is simply falling headlong. Because again, you can translate that word more than one way into English. So it's more just the way that I'm sure I'd have to have a look at other translations as to whether they use headlong in English. They could be using other words as well. But nevertheless, it's describing this falling that's occurred and then burst open and blah, 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 and then that field is known as the field of blood. So Luke's doing this to explain what happened to the traitor as kind of a passing point of A, warning, and B, encouragement to those who need it, either or. And so then now Peter picks back up after Luke's interjection here. He picks back up in verse 20. For it is written in the book of Psalms, and then he gives us two kind of specific quotations. The first one, may his camp become desolate, and let there be no one to dwell in it. And, second quotation, let another take his office. So, the first one, the first quote comes, that first one kind of, may his camp become desolate, and let there be no one to dwell in it, comes from Psalm 69. The specific reference, it's only short, so I don't, if you don't want to turn, that's fine. The specific reference is Psalm 69, verse 25. So Psalm 69, verse 25, which says what it says, right? May the camp be a desolation, or may the camp become desolate, same thing, and let no one dwell in their tents, right? And there be no one to dwell in it. And so he's quoting from that psalm specific. Both of these, by the way, are psalms of David that are being quoted here. This one here is a context in which David essentially is crying out for God to save him from those who have oppressed him, for those who have attacked, from his enemies, to those who attack him, who assail him, and so on and so forth. And here in this imprecatory sense, whether or not this would entirely be considered an imprecatory psalm, I'd have to go and look at the broader context. But he's certainly making what's called an imprecatory prayer here. Imprecatory basically is a phrase describing a number of the psalms where David and or the author, whoever it happens to be, is crying out to God, calling for justice to be visited upon the enemies of Israel. And often in sometimes ways that can be confronting to our modern sensibilities. But it's there are psalms, for example, where the author calls for God to take the babies of the enemies and to smash them against the rocks. And we kind of go, that's how unbiblical. How ungodly. Even though it's included in the Bible. The reason why that kind of statement was made was because that's exactly what a number of the nations around did. You raided, you took slaves, you took, to call them prisoners of war is too lenient. Men who surrendered became slaves, it was that simple, if they weren't killed. And babies who are too hard to take care of, you kill them. Especially if you're the Philistines and you have enough of a blood feud with the Israelites anyway, make a real point of it and make it public. So in other words, the author in those kinds of imprecatory psalms is calling for that concept of lex talionis, right? An eye for an eye. We often think of an eye for an eye in this really nice modern hippie thing of like, that's a bad thing. An eye for an eye is actually a statement of justice, right? Because it's not a head for an eye. It's not take both legs for the eye. It's an eye for an eye. It's equal and parity in justice, right? It's equity in justice. And so basically the author in those kinds of imprecatory psalms the evil that they perpetrate, visit upon them in justice, in righteousness, right? But this reference, like a lot of times in Psalms, a lot of double entendre going on. It's like dual meaning, right? Here, the author, in this case David, is calling for, for their camp to be desolate, right? For emptiness to befall them, for waste to fall them, for all kinds of other bad things to befall them. Verse 24 before it says, "Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your burning anger or wrath overtake them." Right? He's calling upon justice of God. And so here, Peter's actually saying that this, in classic kind of prophetic form, especially in Messianic Psalms and other Psalms, has dual meanings. It had a meaning in the context, especially when David was writing it, and often many of them had a meaning prophetically, looking forward. And so here he's quoting it in that sense in reference to Judas, right? That the enemy of God, that his camp, that which he's built up, would become desolate. It would be emptied out. His works would come to nothing, if I'm speaking kind of symbolically, yeah? And then the second reference from Psalm 109. So that second bit, right, let another take his office, comes from Psalm 109, verse 8. And again, it's another cry for help from David. It's another, in part at least, imprecatory psalm. And it's him crying out for rescue, for salvation from God. And in verse 8, I'll read the broader context. In verse 6, he says, "Appoint a wicked man against him, let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him come forth guilty. Let his prayer be counted as sin. May his days be few, may another take his office." Speaking in his own context, right, and about enemies and about his days being few, like reduce him, like take him out, blah, blah, blah. Someone else take his office, right? And he goes on, he says, may his children be fatherless, his wife a widow, right? He's imprecatory psalm in that fashion. But again, dual meaning. He's also applying it, Peter is also applying this to Judas Iscariot. May his days be few, may another take his office. So Peter is applying those psalms to this context of Judas as well. So the first reference, just to recap, Psalm 69, verse 25. And then the second reference, right, let another take his office, is Psalm 109. So Psalm 109, verse 8. So here, again, using scripture, explaining the fulfillment of prophecy. Peter does a lot of that. He does it on Pentecost as well, again, quite ardently. And so he's explaining to the brothers assembled that this has taken place in accordance with the scriptures, in the fulfillment of prophecy, and so on and so forth. And so then this is why we're now gathered here. This is why we now need to choose another. Okay? And so then from verse 21, we'll then continue to read. So verse 21. "So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us," which occurred, just before this, "one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection." Okay, so here he's setting the criteria, explaining the criteria for apostleship. Inherently, you had to be a witness to the resurrected Christ. Okay. You had to be, so that's, and because sometimes people postulate, oh, well then why was Paul able to be made an apostle? Because he had witnessed the resurrected Christ in a very special manner, right, that we don't see anywhere else, okay? But it's for that reason. So because the criteria for apostleship was a witness to the resurrected Christ, that's why he appears to Paul on the road to Damascus in that special fashion, for multiple reasons, but one of which is the qualification of apostleship. It also means that people who roll around today in certain denominational circles, having the absolute sheer unbridled gall and audacity to refer to themselves as apostles, should wake up in the morning thanking God that they actually draw breath. It's such a pathetically blatant and wanton, not just twisting, but complete ignoring of Scripture. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what this is saying. Okay, the only thing that can overcome an honest reading of this is just sheer arrogance and pride. Okay, and so anyone who stylizes themselves as apostle, the second you hear that, you turn around and you run 100 miles an hour for as long as you physically can before your lungs give out.
After rebuking them.
Huh? Yeah.
After you make it known what they've done.
Yeah, exactly. Too right. Yeah. So it's so the inherent requirement for apostleship, witness to the resurrected Christ. You know what I mean? Okay. Because the whole point is he's saying, and that's why he finishes, he says, one of these men must become with us witnesses to his resurrection. He's kind of also saying, he's saying in the sense of like, you have to have literally witnessed it, and then, double entendre, be a witness to it, as in evangelistically, right? Be a witness to it, right? You then go forward and proclaim what you've seen, right? It's in part why he appeared to 500, right? It's that kind of concept, because this is how, and we've explained this before, but this is how the transmission of the Gospels and of Christ and everything else occurred, right? Eyewitnesses to boom, 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 in verbal, yep, in an oral culture, da, 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 while this is being simultaneously written kind of in the background peripherally, right? And so we have the witness, right, in a really cool form, because we're reading what they spoke, okay? And so we're now hearing, we have access to exactly what was heard by people who literally heard it. We're just now reading it, right? And so that capacity, right? So long story short, it's someone who, and he says it as well from the beginning of the baptism, so he's wanting, so someone, the apostle also needs to be someone who's actually been with Jesus, who's seen what he's done, who's been there, has the context, the whole box and dice, right? Who can attest to the various miracles, to the healings, to the resuscitation, to all the various things, right? And is a witness to these things.
You shall be my witnesses, Jesus.
Exactly. Correct, exactly right. And that's exactly what we looked at whenever, I think it was in the first week or the second week, whenever it was, about being, no, it was last week, yeah. And you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Exactly right. Witnesses, not just like figuratively, but like actually having witnessed. You now, exactly. You saw it and you now go forward. Exactly. So, verse 23. And they put forward two, a man who, in very common fashion in those days, had more than one name. Joseph in Hebrew, Barsabbas in Greek, and Justus in Latin. Right? That's one man, and then the other man we're just simply given one of his names, Matthias. It's actually interesting because if you were to read, if this was like set as a play or like or an opera or a movie, it's like all this detail being given, all this detail. It's not, I know it's one sentence, but it's like, and here's Joseph, who was also called Barsabbas, and was also called Justus, and here's Matthias. and then you expect this guy, you would expect that guy to be the guy who's like getting thinger, and then it just cuts camera to the guy who actually got picked. It's almost like that. It's weird. I don't quite know why he did that, but it's weird that we're given the multiple name, maybe to just make. I have no idea. The only things I can ever think of end up just being funny. It only ends up being things like, oh, Luke gave us the names of the guy who lost, so that people could know who the loser was. Like, I don't know. I don't know. Like, and that's I say that tongue in cheek, but it's just like I don't know why he gave those all three names of the thing, unless it was a matter of Matthias was just commonly known as Matthias, right? But a number of the men of that group who were present, different people in those, different guys in that group knew him by different names and actually only, you know what I mean? So they only knew him as Joseph, or they only knew him as Matthias, Barsabbas, or they only knew him as Justus, right? So that could have been the case. It was common in those days to have more than one, like Mark, the Gospel Mark is often referred to as John Mark.
It's still very common in Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Long names, exactly right. Or in context with the most, actually, a really like a direct comparison is kind of foreign students who come over to university, especially from Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, especially Korea, and they adopt an anglicized name, right, an English name. It's literally that. It's exactly that, right? In that context, you have Hebrew context, lingua franca is Greek, right? the common tongue is Greek, but it's under the auspices of the Roman Empire, right? So Latin is also involved. So having multiple names was just how it was. You had a Hebrew name, a Greek name, etc. Anyway, so those are the two put forward, clearly indicating that they had fulfilled the requirements. We also have to assume that they'd kind of whittled that list down from a broader list as well. It's unlikely they only had just two, but clearly these two, for whatever particular reason, were the ones who were put forward as the options, once you'd kind of filtered down. So then verse 24, and they prayed and said, "You, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and the apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place," which is that place of demise which he referenced earlier. And they cast lots for them, as in for those two, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. Now, 12. So this casting of lots, I think this actually might even be, don't quote me on this, I think this is the last reference to the casting of lots as well. I'm not 100% sure, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it is. Casting lots, for those who are unaware, was a practice common to many ancient societies, not just ancient Israel. What exactly it looked like, we're not exactly sure. There are a number of options. It could have been something to do with sticks, kind of akin to drawing the short straw. Could have been something like that. It also could have been something to do with, there's some historical archaeological evidence to suggest it could have been having almost like these kind of small flat rocks, almost like coins, and used somehow in a sense of almost like flipping a coin. It also could have been a rolling of a dice, or die plural, have been used for millennia on end. They're not a modern invention. Dice have been used, I think, all the way back to ancient Egypt, off memory, and so it could have been something of that fashion. What exactly it was, not sure, but nevertheless, the practice amongst pagan cultures was obviously ascertaining the will of the gods. Here, it was used in a similar fashion. It's God allowing them to use this practice in kind of direct, especially in an Old Testament context where two really important factors applied. One, an incomplete canon of Scripture, right, in terms of its totality. I mean, it was incomplete. It was complete for the time period in which it was in, because that's all that had been written. But in terms of the whole scope, an incomplete canon of Scripture. And two, the nature of the Holy Spirit's interaction. Okay, isolated vertical interactions with prophets, with kings, blah blah blah, but not like what's about to happen. The Spirit of God now coming. Exactly.
The Holy Spirit hadn't been given to them all yet.
Exactly right. So that nature of
God accepted the fact they used this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's God using that context to allow for that factor. Exactly right.
I never thought about that before, but that's good.
Yeah, but from a historical perspective and as well as scripturally, that's kind of the indication we're given. That's why is it's making use of those.
How else were they going to do it?
Yeah, exactly. How? Yeah, without the common indwelling.
Yeah.
Exactly. Without that common indwelling, there's not that level of kind of common spiritual discernment that can take place in that kind of sense. Yeah. So casting of lots were used in that fashion, and it was used here because again, Pentecost still hasn't happened at this point, and it falls upon Matthias. He's therefore picked. Bada bing, bada boom.
I understand that the Israelite priests, always used in that exact way the thumin and umim.
Yeah. Tunin anonym. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, overall through the blessed plate. And so we actually, I think, So yeah, I'm wondering whether, I think there are, I can't remember if there are other references to, there are other references in the New Testament to that reference to the breastplate in that fashion. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there are other references in Acts. I can't think of any. Not off the top of my head, but certainly, obviously, it does come up in portions throughout, in terms of reference as well throughout the New Testament. But yeah, so it's that kind of concept. So that's what's taking place. That's why it's taking place. And I need to go back and check, but I think this is the last reference to lots being cast. So anyway, so there's that. So now,
their reliance on God to make the decision, not themselves.
yeah, correct. The big takeaway here, exactly right. The big takeaway here is what, if we think just very broadly about what Peter's done here, he's established, they're in the context of worship, they're in the context of ecclesia, of the assembly gathered, right, the church gathered. Two, the premise of their undertaking is founded upon Scripture, right, because he references specific examples of how the Scriptures were fulfilled, but he was also speaking broadly as well about this being done to fulfill the Scriptures, right, so there's the exegetical component, right, the scriptural component, and then them taking that in terms of their pragmatic action, is using a means and mechanism that was allowed by God to determine the will of God in this kind of context. Yep. So this kind of is setting patterns as well in terms of like contemporary applications for us, where it might seem pithy, but it's not. It's important. The methodologies of not just what we do, but also the proverbial theory behind why we do what we do, can't just be whatever we think is whatever. Can't just be going on, making it up on the fly. It can't just be what we think is a good idea. Clearly, like what we're being indicated here is that there's a pattern of searching the Scriptures. There's a pattern of biblical basis for A, B, C, D, whatever it is you're talking about, right? And in this case, them choosing apostles, using means and methods that came from the Scriptures, right? So their practice had to be founded upon sound theology, okay? In the same way, to kind of use a similar aphorism to what we had with worship building culture, right? Theology builds practice. That's a...
You can see why Jesus had to say to Peter 3 times,
Yeah.
do you love me?
Yeah, true, yeah.
He was going to be such a...
Yeah, exactly, such a pivotal point. Yeah, exactly right. And so that restoration, that's why it's such a beautiful story, is because of the fact that his role was obviously vital, right, and pivotal alongside Paul. Two different contexts and applications. Yeah, exactly. two different purposes in what they were doing, and what they were destined to do, but their significance in that capacity. Yeah, exactly right. So yeah. So that's the establishment, and this kind of, by the way, is why then Paul. We referenced back in week 1 about, we had those cross references from the ends of Ephesians chapter 1 and chapter 2 about Christ the cornerstone, the apostles the foundation, and then we as citizens of the kingdom of God then building up the temple. That kind of reference, you remember that? Yeah. Well, that's this playing out. Do you know what I mean? Christ the cornerstone, here building the foundation of the apostles. And so Paul, Luke's obvious conclusion here as to why he has included it is then establishing the foundation of the church. It then follows immediately into Pentecost, which is chapter 2, which we kick on to next week, in terms of chapter 2 next week. And so here you've just got natural flow and ordering of the church, and processes being established, prophecies being fulfilled, the Scriptures being upheld, etc., etc., etc. So that's the end of chapter 1. And a pretty good outlining of necessary details. Probably, all the details you would want for the foundation of the church before then Pentecost as a real kind of initiatory act occurs is certainly fulfilling what you would want in an opening chapter like this from a historical perspective. And so, now the apostleship is established. It is what it is. And so then now the church goes forth and gets built. As a very minor point in brevity, we're also seeing patterns of leadership be established, right? So we're in a specific time where apostleship was obviously required because, again, the Scriptures are still being written at this point, and their actions literally are still being written. And so then it's also the apostles that are then giving this authority to then go forth and establish pastors / elders / bishops, whichever English word you want to use. And in other words, the episkopoi, the presbyteroi in Greek and Hebrew, the leaders of churches, right? So Paul appoints Timothy, right? And Timothy then also appoints other elders, is the command given, or he does the same thing, that's in Ephesus, he does the same thing for Titus at the church on the Isle of Crete, the Greek Isle of Crete. And so that's that model of leadership that's being proposed forward, as to then the apostles having the authority to then go forward, build churches, establish endemic leadership in and among those churches, and then just build. Yeah. So questions and comments. Still got the microphone up there that you pass around. Just keep it held up around here as if you're holding a big microphone, and let's go for it. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment that
Yep.
verse 14, it says
Yep.
they continued in one accord and in prayer. So they were all completely sort of like, which doesn't seem to happen in lots of prayer meetings. Well, I mean, I'm not saying myself that I'm the judge, but
No, I know what you mean. Though.
you know what I mean. It's like in one accord. That is just an amazing thing.
Yeah.
To be in a prayer meeting, then people are all sort of like praying the same thing, praying what God wants. Yeah.
Yeah. There was exactly. Yeah, there was a unity of
Purpose.
There was a unity of theology, a unity of worship.
Yes.
And a common unity, therefore, in prayer.
That really struck me.
Exactly. Yeah. So that concept of
They
being in one
had
accord
in
is important.
common the fact they were waiting for the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. They weren't. They're already.
Points of view or anything.
Yeah. These things are starting to click for them by this point now. So they're so the difficulties that they've often had throughout the Gospels, where things have just straight over the head sometimes, are now kind of post-resurrection, having seen the resurrected Jesus, been with him, all that kind of thing. These things are now starting to fall into place and kind of click.
Remembering
Yeah, exactly.
the things
what he
that
said.
Jesus said. It's good for you that I go away.
Exactly, all those things, and even the context of, and even retroactively too, the way in which Jesus spoke about the things that he was doing, right, and how that often didn't compute for them because they didn't have that reference. They just didn't get it. Sometimes by design, sometimes by their own fault. But now some of those things probably retroactively for them are starting to go, and they go, oh, that's why.
That's it.
Yeah, penny drop, exactly right. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So that penny drop kind of thing.
Exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that penny drop is also starting to happen to them too. And so they're here, they're now gathering this way, they're referencing scripture. You can see it starting to click. Especially by then when Peter delivers his sermon at Pentecost in the next chapter, it's entirely more than half of it is just him directly quoting from Old Testament sources, right? Penny dropping, things aligning, clicking. Yeah. So, yeah. Any other questions, comments?
No, I was just looking at this.
Got a little microphone way there.
Sorry. Yeah.
Just looking at the photo, I'm thinking that, for some of those apostles, that they've come from such poor backgrounds, fishermen and, carpenters.
Peter and stuff, for sure, yeah.
So they're in this context. It must have been like
exactly.
fish out of water,
yeah, good
so
pun.
to speak.
True, in one sense, for sure. It is possible that, it's entirely possible actually, that many of them, especially when you talk about the broader group of 120, that many of them would have never stepped foot in a residence like this. Yeah, sure. It's but that's the interesting part that occurs. Is it's fascinating to read, especially through Acts, where you have this cross-pollination of different ethnic groups, different cultural groups, different socioeconomic groups, right? Various things.
Status.
Yep. Even the more common assembling and intermingling of men and women, even just as a base point, was also something which was different. Obviously, ancient kind of in Old Testament context, it wasn't exactly like what you have, say, in Islam today, where there's quite often a pretty hard line partitioning between worship for men and worship for women. But there was, in a social-cultural context, that element still, and that's always been the case. Every ancient culture had that to one degree and another. But in terms of common assembly and fellowshipping, there's still ordering of things, obviously, but there's even that cross-pollination as well. So that's why you then, because it's weird sometimes for us to read in our context, like Paul explaining things about like slavery and about how slaves would be treated and so on. Because it's for us now, and praise God, but for us now it's so far removed, like culturally. But these are the kind of, this is why you then had, this is what you had mainly. You had Jew and Greek, slave and free, man and woman, box and dice, right? The whole box and dice.
All in one accord.
Yeah, exactly, all in one court. And so it comes back to that concept of my kingdom's not of this world. It's in the world, but not of the world, right? So it's operating parallel to the kingdoms of the earth, and it is operating in ways that share similarities, but often have certain differences. So that's what leads to having dirt poor peasants sitting right next to like really wealthy people, right? Theophilus, Mary the mother of Mark, people who, you know what I mean? It's just, but there's an equality of citizenship in this kingdom. People have different gifts, people have different abilities, different roles, right? So like clearly the apostles are set apart. Clearly the pastors / elders are set apart. But it's not a set above. It's not a set below. It's a set apart. That's really what, and that's what the word, even a common word that we have, like sacred, right? Coming from sacramentum in the Latin, it literally means something that is consecrated, aka set apart. It means set for a specific purpose, because the apostles have incredible fellowship with the Christians that they convert, with the churches they build, right? They're just set apart for a specific purpose, and that's honky-dory, right? The church leaders, right, the whatever title you want to refer to them by, are set apart. They're not set above. They're set apart for a purpose, and that's all good. Do you know what I mean? But there's still this level of fraternity that exists. You know what I mean, in that fellowship. And so that's what's fascinating to then see. Do you want to pass that over to Costa? Good, thank you.
That's a very good point, because that's one of our reminders to the people we try to witness to, the world, that Christianity is the most inclusive.
Oh, yeah.
It's the most egalitarian.
Oh.
We have black brothers and sisters, yellow brothers and sisters, white, green, polka dot.
Yeah, purple, pink.
Rich, poor.
A slight shade of mauve, any other colour you want to include.
Whereas the other religions, very hierarchical. Extreme. The caste system.
Massively, oh yeah.
Horribly hierarchical. You cannot go from one to another. You cannot sit in an upper room in some religions, the high caste with the low caste.
No, you wouldn't. A Brahmin wouldn't get caught
Not possible.
even in the same postcode as an untouchable. No.
And so it's and you've got all ends of the earth being included in Jesus's the congregation, the temple. We are the bricks.
Yeah.
Interesting that the Lord created man on the sixth day, but prepared the earth from day 1 to day 6. Yeah. All that preparation. So earth must be very special, correct? And just on that point, Luke in chapter 2, the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 2, verse 49, then he said to them, this is Jesus as a young lad. Yeah. He said, why were you seeking me? So his first word on planet Earth was why. And we know in Scripture the first mention of something is extremely important. And in Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus' last word on earth was earth. So the first word is why, and the last word is earth. Why earth? That's very interesting if you think about it. If you think about it, that says so many things to me. No other life on other planets, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely. No other life on other planets. No, Earth.
Good point. Yeah. It's there's a speaking to purpose. It's no, you're exactly right. I'm with you. It's those elements of and that this is why this historical narrative is so important, right? It's why there's going to the effort of actually compiling historical narrative is, I mean, we'd just be dead in the water. Like, without even just the 4 Gospels alone, let alone any other text, we'd be so up the river without a paddle, because the historical accounting of what went on is literally and figuratively foundational to anything else that comes around it, right? The Pauline canon, right? Paul's letters, the epistles of Paul, are often sometimes colloquially referred to as basically commentaries, and they are actually, in a sense, that, right? They are in many ways kind of how you have, you go to a Christian bookstore, you can buy commentaries on the book of, pick a book of Acts or whatever, right? Paul's letters are, in essence, at least on one level, a commentary or series of commentaries on the Gospels, right? It's taking the actions, taking what's given in the Gospels, and then writing out commentary and theological exposition from that. That's really what it is on one level. And so it's also why, as just a side point, ideas like, that sometimes get postulated even by pastors or theologians about who don't have a genuine commitment to the sanctity and the inerrancy and the infallibility of Scripture, right, who have compromised and already slidden away from that. Postulations about ideas like, it isn't important whether or not the Scriptures are accurate, or it isn't important whether or not the Gospels contain errors or not contain errors, or whatever the postulation is, that doesn't matter. That's the indication this person has abandoned the concept of sola scriptura. They've abandoned the concept of the infallibility or inerrancy of Scripture, whichever word, both words are good words. They've abandoned that idea of the sanctity of Scripture, right? And it allows them, right? And the second that you take your pinky toe and move it just 1 millimeter to the right from that idea, you're done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Done. Because from that point, right, just a slight 1 degree shift, okay, allows you infinite room to compromise on anything, right? It's not. It's not because this isn't an idol. It's actually because of the fact that you have to value the God who wrote it, okay. And the only way to get around that is either to, one, have some out of left field view that God somehow is fallible, or two, which is the infinitely more common way of doing it, is to believe that certain parts of Scripture are more important than others, right? I understand that the original intention behind red letter Bibles was a good idea, and this is a side point, but it was a noble idea. So I won't say it's good. It was an honourable idea, okay? Because sometimes, especially in John's Gospel, it can sometimes be, if you're not paying attention, you can sometimes miss where John's writing versus where Jesus is speaking, right? Especially some of the earlier chapters, like chapter 3 has that a lot. But what it's done, I think the consequences of it have been a bit worse than otherwise intended, because sometimes it can be, here's the red letter, here's the important words, and then here's the other words. You know what I mean? Here's the other words. It's just like, no. Paul's deliberations about such and such and such and such in the introduction into the Colossians or the Philippians or whichever book you want to pick are just as relevant as Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Random stories like the one I referenced however many weeks ago about from I think 2 Kings 22 or somewhere around there, about Elijah or Elisha, whichever one it was, being mocked by the young boys, and then God sending those 2 bears to maul them to death. That's as important as the account of Jesus dying on the cross, right? So the entirety of the canon of Scripture. Yeah. So, yeah. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts? One more? Go for it. Yeah. Or could Koski just pass that one over again? Beauty.
Oh, sorry. It's okay.
Yeah,
It's okay. I was thinking what I was thinking of was about what you
we can
said
edit that
about
part out, fortunately.
what you said about the credentials of apostles,
apostleship,
which actually is very clear. Really, I read actually something from a commentary this morning before I came, and it really is striking that they were witnesses of the resurrection. I thought that was just,
Yeah.
you know, that
Yeah.
if you
Vital.
witness something, if you're an eyewitness, that is something really special.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, vital. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because there was no in a time, and again, it's just like it's not. This isn't the modern day where we have crime scene investigation units where we have units that can come, police units that can come in and swab for fingerprints and do chemical analyses and blood printing and all those kinds of various other technologies that thank God we have. Like you don't have witnesses, well, there's no case. It doesn't matter how bad it is, murder, and name a crime. No witnesses. I mean, good luck. It's just not going to. What on earth is going to happen? I mean, you can find it, even if you find a dead body, but where are the witnesses as to who did it? Who did? You're not. That's what I'm saying. You're not swabbing the scene for prints because that doesn't exist. You can't use these various technologies and evidences which are just commonplace in our judicial system today. And so, actual eyewitness testimony was. Outside of other evidence, there's more evidence than just eyewitness. But if there's no eyewitnesses, you're done. That's why even in the Torah, having 2 eyewitnesses to a crime, a major crime like murder or rape or anything else like that, was required. And so having that eyewitness element, No, it would take too long to explain it. I was going to explain about the woman caught in adultery, but it would require a lot more time than that. Yeah, you're smiling because you know what I was going to say. That would require more time because you may never have heard it before. Yeah, I won't go into there. Anyway, one of the issues that comes up in that story is that where are the eyewitnesses? I'll leave it at that because we would require another half an hour. But anyway, those eyewitness testimonies in an oral culture, in the way that judicial systems work forever, up until about for all intents and purposes 5 minutes ago, was vital. So witnessing and saying that he really did that, especially when you start to talk about him healing blind people and resuscitating Lazarus from the dead in that essence, right? And rising from the dead, especially when you're then going to walk into Athens, whose scholars and whose philosophers absolutely, they don't just find it laughable, they find it absolutely abhorrently offensive. The very concept of wanting to be resurrected, especially to an Epicurean or Stoic philosopher in those days, was laughable. Anyone who took Plato seriously would have found that laughable as to why on earth you would ever want to be brought back to this decrepit flesh. Because to Platonists, to Platonist philosophers of any stripe or variety, the body was a proverbial prison. The body and the flesh, the material things, were the down, lowly, corrupted elements, right? And elevating to the world or to the plane of ideals, and that kind of concept of spiritual ascension in a kind of Platonic philosophical sense was what was desired. So the idea of wanting to resurrect the physical body was just an absolute joke. Huh? Yeah, exactly. In one sense, yeah, exactly. And so no, I'm with you. Yeah. So in the part of.
Did you hear what he said?
Yeah.
Resurrecting the physical body.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
No. The
glorified body. Yeah, and that's why that's the intersection. Yeah, exactly, and that's the intersect, because I'm saying that's the point he's drawing out, and again that's the Greek connection. The understanding that this concept of being wanting to raise in the physical body, they actually were in that sense. They're in the trajectory of being right, as Greek philosophy often sometimes was. They were they were in the same postcode. They weren't on top of it though, right? They were still wrong in a lot of other areas. Not to mention just their general pagan practice. But that's why it was laughed at. And so when you're then going into that environment, having eyewitness testimony to actually witnessing it, to people who were very smart, often in terms of like speaking to sophists or philosophers, and people who were highly educated, who were in the lineage of men like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Zeno, etc., that eyewitness element, absolutely vital. That's why we're getting historical accounting. That's why we're getting historical narratives. So.